Bonjour à tous et à toutes, bienvenue à la Villa Méditerranée. Hello everybody. For the people who don't understand French, don't forget the headphone at the entry of the room. Eh bien, bonjour à tous, bienvenue à la Villa Méditerranée. Nous sommes très heureux de vous accueillir pour ces 2 jours de conférence. Je suis Elodie, je suis la directrice adjointe de l'AMI. L'un des 2 organisateurs de ces 2 journées. AMI
is a structure based at the Fiche Build in Marseille. It's one of the founding members of the Fiche. We have a number of activities which are in 3 areas. One area on aesthetic aspects, with creative residencies, also with artistic practice theme, with rehearsal facilities, and also a program of workshops on a program called Village of Pop for youth and urban culture. And the third part of our activities is what we call the entrepreneurs, which concerns our day tomorrow. So, as part of this theme of the entrepreneurs, in 2008 we launched a business incubator dedicated to cultural activities. And in 2013 we launched the Dynamo platform, which enables us to welcome project leaders. Since the incubator started, we have had a number of contacts. We have also been the lead partner of a European program called Sostenuto. We've also participated in a capitalization program called Trucifor, the aim of which was to capitalize on all of our experience with business incubators in Europe. And thanks to this international experience on the European level, we have had the opportunity and desire to also develop this kind of operation on the international level. And this is why we have asked the region to help us link the Incubinc project. Incubinc is an incubator of incubators with 3 partners who are here with us today. The Racine Association, based in Casablanca. This association started in 2006 and has launched many different activities, in particular the mobilization around the cultural policy and also supporting young structures to help them set up cultural projects. An incubator without, in an informal sense, they'll be talking to us during these 2 days. We also have as one of our partners the Champs Theatre. This is a historic organization which has been supporting live performance artists in Beirut in its location. And in our last partner is the Samaro Association and African Freedom Station. The Samaro Association is the Samaro Foundation. Samaro is equivalent to the SASEM in South Africa. The foundation decided to work with the African Freedom Station to develop an incubator in Johannesburg. The idea of this project, of course, is to support our partners in setting up incubators, their incubators, but it's also to exchange together about good practice using experimental approaches, and also to try to reconnect European networks on a more worldwide level, and also to develop a new type of cooperation which is around the Mediterranean and the Arab world, the Maghreb, and also Africa more broadly. So we have started an adventure which will last 1 year, which will end this year, but it won't be finished after that because we are currently working on a more long-term project. I'd like to thank the Regional Council for their support and the French institutions who have also helped us with the mobility of our partners here today. We have Jumana, who represents the Intermediation Foundation, who is one member of our board of directors. She will explain to us what is the purpose of the Roberto Foundation. Then Jean-Luc will talk about the Villa Méditerranée. Thank you for being here with us today. Good morning. My name is Jumana Yasiri. I'm a member of the board of directors of the Roberto Foundation for 1 year now. Before that, I was part of the expert committee for 5 years, and before that I obtained 2 mobility grants from the fund. I'm very pleased to be with you here today. I'd like to thank Ferdinand, Angie, and everybody else for having invited me to give these words of welcome today. I'm also thinking of Jean Double, like a double agent, because I've also benefited from the AMI training courses some years ago. So a kind of double agent. The Roberto Cimetta fund is quite unique because it supports free mobility and circulation in the region, in the European Arab region, and also beyond that. When you talk about freedom of mobility and circulation, you're also talking about freedom of imagination and creation. And it is a way of supporting artistic creation in a more diverse and open and accessible way for everybody, especially during this time when mobility is not just a need, it's a vital necessity for people to be able to survive. And so the Roberto Cimetta Fund is very attentive to these changes that are taking place in the region at the moment. And we fully intend to support them and to set up programs dedicated to artists who are migrating and in exile right around the region at the moment and in Europe. Also, I'd like to wish you a very warm welcome. I'd like to thank everybody.
Okay.
Good morning, everyone. I'd like to apologize. I'm talking in the name of Bernard Vellero, the ambassador who runs the AViTeM and the Villa Méditerranée, who unfortunately cannot be with us here today. He had planned to be with you and to give a few words of presentation, and above all to say how pleased we are to welcome you here for these 2 days of work, especially to welcome these two partners who, for us, are very exceptional and who have been carrying out very important work for many years. They're not always very visible compared to other partners we work with, who work with the general public. I'm thinking for particular of the Festival of Aix-en-Provence, or Festival of Marseille, or the Rencontre d'Arles. We also work in great detail with other partners, and whether it's the Roberto Cimetta Fund or the AMI Center, the part of the cultural industries, which is the area I'm specialized in. I think here we have two very important partners in this sphere, which enable us to really make progress with our different projects, and we'll be talking about this over the next 2 days. So I'd like to say how pleased we are to welcome you here, and also perhaps to just give you the hashtag and the Wi-Fi code. There's a Wi-Fi which is freely available. Just say you want to connect up to the Wi-Fi of the Villa Méditerranée, and on the hashtag you have on the AMI FRC hashtag you can follow all of the conversations and also participate in the discussions, whether it's here or from the other end of the world, thanks to streaming which has been set up. So I hope you enjoy these 2 days of work. I'll hand over now to Ferdinand Richard, who is the director of AMI and the president of the Roberto Cimetta Fund. He's going to be moderating these 2 days. He has two heads in a way. Thank you very much. Yes, good morning, everyone. I'm very pleased that it's raining, because that way you have no reason to escape to the beach. You're stuck here, which is good news. It's true that a little bit of sunshine would be nice, but maybe that will happen later if we'll make an effort. I'm very pleased to see all of you here today. It's one stage, it's the completion of a very long piece of work. The Roberto Cimetta Fund has been in existence for many years, about 15 years altogether. As for the AMI, it will celebrate its 31st anniversary next year. We're coming to the first cycle of 50 years, and so we'll be starting our next 50th year. What's important for me is that we have a lot of young, dynamic, brilliant and intelligent people who are on the starting blocks and who are already working with us. The work is carrying on. The history is not just the history of Ferdinand Richard, I'm just supporting, doing what I can. A lot of people have been present before us, and others will take over afterwards. This conference is just a time when we'll be able to meet up and give people plenty of energy for the future. We have a few technical issues we talk about. First of all, speed dating this evening. This will be taking place here. We have 10 tables. We'll explain how that's going to happen. Then we have the streaming. The streaming is very important for us. Over the last few years, we've always had made sure these conferences open to the rest of the world, so that people can listen, not just listen in a passive way, but also participate through tweets. They can ask questions using Twitter. The questions will be given to us here at the discussion panel. The tweet is AMIFRC in uppercase, and then after that, CONF in lowercase. For those of you who've come here specially for that, there will be a big party here in Marseille, so put your dancing shoes on this evening. We have headsets for the translation, and also we have an artistic aperitif. Of course, that's why we're here. As for the artists, they will be here at lunchtime for an aperitif. And now I'm going to give you a presentation. Each day starts with an introductory speech from a researcher or a thinker who has been thinking in great detail about the thing we're working on. Today we're very lucky to have Svetlana Mintcheva, who has joined us from New York, and who is the director of the National Coalition Against Censorship. So we're going to be talking about freedom of expression, and what's important also is that we have a way of looking at situation which isn't just here in Europe and the Arab world. The idea is that self-censorship is something that happens everywhere. It's not, you don't just have dictatorships where you have censorship in other countries where there's complete freedom and complete democracy, complete freedom. It's a little more complicated than that. And Svetlana is going to talk to us about that. Merci de nous avoir rejoints.
Et bien sûr, on aura la possibilité de poser des questions après l'intervention.
Questions after Svetlana's speech.
Switching languages, and I just speak some French, but I think if I start speaking in French, you'll be all on your knees begging me to speak English, so because I murdered the language. Thank you so much, Gavina, Angie, and all the organizers of this for holding this conference, and also for having me here. Not only because it's wonderful to visit Marseille, but because these kind of connections and networking on a worldwide level are best done in person. So it's I'll be talking more about networks, but it's good to meet people face to face, and it's good for our work. The title of my talk, Artist Freedom of Circulation, Freedom of Expression, Progress or Deterioration, was assigned to me. I didn't invent it. So it's a kind of challenge that I will address. I'm not sure I will exactly answer, and I'm not sure it's quite answerable. So on a global scale, constructing a narrative of progress, of artistic freedom or deterioration kind of depends on whether you're a pessimist or you're an optimist. You can construct both narratives. And it also depends on how exactly you define freedom and freedom of expression in particular. So on the one hand, you can look at the recent report issued by the Danish organization FreeMuse, they work mostly on freedom in music, but also freedom of expression in other artistic fields. And that report registered 469 cases of censorship for 2015 and violation of artists' rights. And this was twice the number of cases registered in 2014. So you can also assume that there are many more cases that have not been recorded, also many more cases of pre-censorship, of film, for instance, that never was produced, a play or an exhibition that never came to light, so it was never suppressed. There were books that were never published. There was all sorts of things that could have existed, but doesn't. When you look at it in a more positive light, you can say, well, we have better ways of recording violations. We have better networks, people that are recording them and telling them about what happened. And artistic freedom is becoming a more important issue on the world stage. More cases would also be a sign of more challenges to the status quo. That is, there is something that is bothering the powers that be. And this is always a sign of health in the arts. And it means that they're relevant to the times and they're bothering the state or institutions in power. And that might sound a little paradoxical, but my own personal story was I grew up in Bulgaria during the Cold War, where there was a strict regime of censorship, and then I came to the United States in the 90s, the home of the free. And I have been working in the US for the last 16 years on freedom of speech, specifically artistic freedom. So Bulgaria had a very strong and open regime of censorship. There were no censorship controversies. It was very quiet. Nobody was producing anything that could actually bring down the anger of the state. There were, of course, like little challenges, indirect critiques, but overall, it was silence. There was no controversy. The only controversy began to appear in the 80s when the regime was becoming unstable. So coming to the US, in the 90s, you've probably heard of the culture wars, where politicians in Congress were trying to take away funding from the arts. And that was a result of a political production in the arts addressing issues like AIDS, feminism, very active art sphere that was responded to by the state by trying to defund the arts. So something was changing socially at that point, and you have a high visibility of arts controversies. After 2000, we haven't had that much high visibility, especially on the federal level. So what is going on? Are we completely free? And what, in my work, I have been seeing is that institutions have become very sophisticated from the 90s. They know when controversy is going to happen. They're also really fearful. And they're fearful not because they're going to be put in jail, but because their funding will be cut and they will die as an institution. So they have to choose sometime, do we support artistic freedom or do we exist? You have a kind of structural pre-censorship, but what can even come into the light of day? And then also you have multiple vectors of self-restriction on the personal and institutional level and self-censorship. So self-censorship is always this hidden larger reality of censorship, both in repressive regimes where the censors know you can't do that, is interiorized by the artist or by the institution saying we can't dare do that because we'll just be shut down or we'll be punished. And on the other hand, we also have it in neoliberal democracies where the choice is between artistic freedom and the livelihood of the institution. So when we're to answer this question of whether there is more or less artistic freedom today, we have to take into account self-censorship, and that is very hard to measure because few people and few institutions confess to it. But also when we look through the prism of structural restrictions on artistic freedom, the kind of we have it and you don't dichotomy between a free liberal West and an unfree other of repressive regimes begins to blur. The West is by far not the heroic guardian of free speech that is going to export it to the rest of the world. So we have to look, if we want to work for artistic freedom worldwide, we have to look at the conditions everywhere and what is really restricting freedom of speech. So if we develop structures of resistance, they have to go across the board. And we also have to work to expand cultural debate, not only remove obstacles. And opening up cultural space is ongoing work, it is complex work, and it involves both reactive and proactive strategies, and I'll talk about that later. So my talk has two sections, and one is an overview of issues confronting freedom of expression, issues in censorship today, and it's a kind of some of the new challenges facing us. And then the second part is the hope and the opportunity, what we can hope to do. So classic censorship in terms of state suppression of work for the public good and the maintenance of order persists, especially in less democratic countries, but also so-called democracies like Russia are really upping their control. They have new laws about blasphemy and obscenity, and these have been used to fire an opera director for a production of Tannhäuser, which is plays with religion. They were used in the Pussy Riot case. So there is more and more of an activation of those laws supposed to protect us. And this is a good thing to keep in mind, that censorship always works for the so-called public good. Now, who is defining that public good is the big question. The Free Muse report, which is online and you should all check, has a lot of breakdown by countries of instances of repressive censorship. And obviously, I can't even physically go through those. But it exists and they're being recorded. But at the same time, what I really want to talk about is increased censorship in so-called liberal democracies, which is connected to both geopolitical, economic, and technological developments. And just to enumerate, we have the neoliberal privatization of cultural and public space, fears of terrorism, threats of violence, broadly and excessively enforced hate speech laws, restrictions on the circulation of individuals, growth of a kind of tribalism, and religious fundamentalism. And here I have to make a distinction between legal censorship, which especially in the US, if there's a lawyer in the room, they're always quick to say this is not censorship because censorship legally is suppression by the state. My definition of censorship is wider, and it is all these conditions and institutions that are restricting speech and that go beyond government enforcement, that include government enforcement but go beyond it, because if we look at what defines the openness of our public sphere, government is not the only actor, and we have to take this into account. Cultural institutions in neoliberal societies are left to survive in a free market, and more so in Europe. This used to be the American way, but now it's becoming global. And they're dependent on funding streams. And depending on funding streams, funding for the arts always being the kind of last line in the budget, they are very anxious and risk-averse. Market demands bring on commercialization and all its hallmarks, the need to brand oneself as an institution, the need to bring in very wide audiences, the need to do blockbuster exhibitions, and so on. And then accompanying this is self-censorship. When are you going to alienate your audience? When are you going to alienate your funders? And even though they talk about the public interest, this discussion of the public interest becomes a kind of wishful rhetoric. Sometimes it's forgotten altogether. And to give you just a couple of examples of recent cases in the US, just a few weeks ago, a Jewish community center in Miami, in Florida, which had a wonderful theater. They staged a play by a British Jewish playwright, Julia Pascal, called Crossing Jerusalem. They're not liberal Jews even in that center. They're pretty mainstream people. They loved the play. And then there was a group of people that really want to impose their own view of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. They protested the play because they did not think it corresponded to their particular ideological position. They protested vocally, and protest is fine, but the community center canceled it entirely. We had, you probably heard about that a year or so ago, the Metropolitan Opera did a production of John Adams's The Death of Klinghoffer, which is about the 80s hijacking of the cruise ship in the Mediterranean, where there was the killing of one American Israeli. And the opera is not, what do you say, biased in any way. It does give singing roles to some of the Palestinian terrorists. There were enormous protests around the production, and the international live streaming was canceled because you people in Europe should not be able to see that opera because there's so much anti-Semitism in Europe. People might walk out of the theaters and, I don't know, do something horrible. So the assumption was it would have a harmful effect if live streamed in Europe. So all the live streaming was canceled, and that was under pressure to a large extent by people who are giving money to the Metropolitan Opera. The Metropolitan Opera is a very expensive institution. They require millions and millions to survive. So they're vulnerable to those donors. I'm not meaning to say that the only conflict in the US politically is around Israel-Palestine, but this is it's very frequently encountered. Aside from the privatization of cultural space, you also have this new development due to our, living our lives on social media, which is what I'd call the privatization of public space. And the public space we have is less and less the street or the cafe. It's Facebook, it's Twitter. It's how we listen to our news, how we communicate with our peers. This all happens on social media. But of course, social media platforms are all private. And even though I use them to discuss everything from the absurdities of the U.S. Presidential election to the latest controversy in artistic freedom, we sign a contract with social media, and we have to conform to their terms of service, which terms of service are quite restrictive. Facebook, for instance, is taking a kind of paternalistic role of removing content which is entirely legal, but which it considers sensitive. And that includes museum and gallery ads containing nude photographs, no matter how established the artist. So Facebook started as, historically as a small community on a college campus. They have predicted that by 2013, they will have a community of 5 billion. Setting community guidelines for a community of 5 billion is just plain incoherent. If 5 billion people on this earth do not agree on the same guidelines, so they're setting the most restrictive. They're setting, say, Saudi guidelines on nudity on the whole world. And theoretically, a competitive market would resolve the issue. But given the de facto monopoly, if I ask you what kind of social media and search engine you checked, it will probably be Google, Facebook, Twitter, Amazon. These companies are buying out smaller companies. There is no real competition. So as a user, you have very few real choices. And eventually, Facebook and Twitter start controlling your news stream, the kind of in the virtual public sphere. And there's been a new development that is very interesting in that we're involved in opposing together with other organizations in response to threats of terrorism and the use of social media to recruit people for ISIS and so on. There have been government pressures on social media to cut content that incites terrorism. Now, government is not doing this directly because they can't, because especially in the US there is the First Amendment. Whatever speech this is political speech, it is free speech. But as a private company, Facebook or Twitter can censor whatever they want. Now, my concern is who will decide, even if we decide that there's some speech that crosses the line, who will decide what to remove? And current practice, current evidence is not very promising because we have, it's mostly robotic, the way the decisions are made. And when content is cut, Facebook says, no, there is a human reviewing it. But that human has about 5 seconds probably to review material. And to give you an example, again, going back to nudes, they routinely confuse a painting of a nude with a photograph of a nude because of the flesh tone. So I would not trust the person who confuses a photograph of a nude and a painting of a nude to tell me exactly what content is political and what crosses the line into incitement to violence and terrorism. So that's the technology. And then, of course, we all live in a world where violence has become kind of part of threats of violence are part of our existence. Probably not really statistically. I think there are much more dangerous things to life, but in terms of the presence of terrorism as a threat in our field of anxiety, it looms high. And when it comes to an exhibition, this conjunction between credible threats of violence and social media is becoming very dangerous. You could have social media threats of violence, social media petitions to remove a show, or else there will be violence. And in response to that, what does an institution do? Can you afford to disregard threats of violence when you know there has been real violence, when you know that perhaps, maybe there's a small chance, but you are exposing your audience? Even before the Charlie Hebdo massacre happened, the Barbican in London canceled a show, Exhibit B, by a South African artist, Brett Bailey, partly because it was fearing violence. There were protests, there were petitions on social media, and it came to the point where the police was counseling the Barbican to cut the show because there might be violence. Show never happened. Shortly after the massacre, an installation by Zulika Boabdella at the Pavillon Vendôme in Clichy was taken down because of a warning coming from a Federation of Muslim Citizens of Clichy that some violence could occur as a consequence of the exhibition. The Federation was not even threatening violence itself. They were saying, well, maybe there would be violence. And those social media campaigns are very easily generated. You just have to click, click, click. And terrorist violence has become too real for threats to be ignored. So we can likely predict that a kind of mob rule of people on social media threatening is gaining momentum because they could prevail without prevailing in the marketplace of ideas. They could just issue a threat. And then on the other hand, again, as a result of terrorist attacks, we have overly aggressive enforcement of laws in Europe regarding speech inciting terrorism or hate speech. And the examples in France, I'm sure you're all aware of, but there was also a case in Madrid, just I believe in January or February, where a puppet show was closed and the artists were arrested because it was a kind of Punch and Judy show, violent, and they were using a play on words that combined Al-Qaeda and ETA, the Basque terrorist organization. So they were charged with glorifying terrorism and promoting hatred, and this was within the frame of a puppet show. Things like that are happening. They were subsequently released. I think the case against them has not been closed. And of course, then there's the issue of mobility and passports. And on the one hand, there is the refusal of passports by more repressive regimes. We had a case recently with Christine Tomé, the founding director of Ashkal Alwan, who was refused a passport, and then because she's such a prominent figure, there was international outcry. Her passport was granted, but there are so many others whose passports are held, and they're not even told why. And I totally relate to that because in Bulgaria, when I was growing up, to leave the country, you had a passport. And getting a passport was a privilege, not a right. So a passport was refused to many people for reasons they could not fathom sometimes. And sometimes the reason was the political involvement of their husband's father who they'd never met. That's a true case. So very easily an artist could be threatened by this refusal. But what is interesting that it's also Western democracies are closing borders, and American visa procedures all the way back after 9/11 really changed, and they became very expensive, much more arbitrary, and very labyrinthine. According to the Homeland Security Department records, requests for the standard foreign performance visa declined by almost 20% between 2006 and 2010. And in the same period, the number of visa petitions rejected went up by more than 2/3. So the problem is compounded. On the one hand, you might be refused a passport. On the other hand, because you come from a part of the world that is an enemy part of the world, you might not be given a visa, or your visa will be delayed so long that you cannot participate in the concert or cultural event that you want to come from. I remember I went to the New York Film Festival a few years ago. Abbas Kiarostami, a famous figure, could not come because his visa was delayed. So it's this kind of denial through delay without even actually denying a visa. And I have to say something also about what is happening in the US now. There's an interesting development that's sort of specifically US, and I don't know whether it will spread or not. And it's a kind of it's a censorship coming from the left. And it's connected to me to a new tribalism, which is, we look at our social media stream, we communicate with our friends, we're rarely confronted with the ideas of others. We don't watch TV anymore. So we'll kind of start living in echo chambers of consensus. We all agree and things become obvious and taken for granted. And of course, why not shut down everybody else? And this applies equally to the left and the right. And if anybody's been watching the US elections, you see how we live in different worlds, kind of parallel worlds. So the left is raising this issue, which is an important issue, about the ethics and social effects of symbolic expression. And that goes against the absolutist defense of free speech. So it's increasingly recognized that any practice of freedom is inevitably affected by the social and political context of unequal power relations. The equal right to free speech has unequal value for unequal actors in the public sphere. So where you're speaking from affects not only what you say, it affects how you're heard and how seriously you're taken, what kind of value is attributed to your words. So I agree with that kind of analysis. I think these are all important points. On the other hand, when it comes to specific practical decisions as to what to do as a response to this, sometimes the knife takes the place of the X-ray, and things are cut rather than analyzed. And just two recent examples. There was a publisher, a children's book publisher in the US, Scholastic, that has been around for 93 years, pulled the book from the market, first time in 93 years. It was a children's book, and it was about George Washington, President George Washington's chef. And apparently he was one of the first celebrity chefs. His name was Hercules. He also happened to be a slave. Now, the book was written for little kids. It was a picture book. And critics thought that the book was presenting the atmosphere in the George Washington household as too happy. There wasn't enough reflection of the pain of slavery. So fine. I think it was an interesting critique. I think it was a very, it provoked a very interesting public conversation. But what does Scholastic do? They took the book out of bookstores, and I think they're just going to destroy it. So is that enough reason to destroy a book? Let's talk about it. But their extreme reaction, unprecedented reaction, was very telling. There was also a show at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts this summer, which is a kind of large, venerable institution. And there was a kimono as part of the show, and it was in conjunction with Monet's painting of his wife in an uchikake, a type of kimono. So a Japanese company created a replica of that kimono, and people were trying it on. So they had this interactive Kimono Wednesdays. People were invited to try it on and take selfies. There were protests. They were saying this is cultural appropriation and racism and Orientalism, and again, all valid points. What did the museum do? Cancel the whole interactive component. So to me, the problem here is not so much that there is this lively debate, which should happen, it's time for it to happen, but the fear that institutions, publishers have and say, well, better not even talk about it. Just let's remove it. So we do need to think of free speech in a more complex way, as a value that cannot be seen in isolation from its political context, and an ethical rather than a merely legal issue. So we do need a vigorous critique, but the failure of institutions that disseminate the arts to take on real controversy around difficult subject matter that could be offensive, that could be traumatic, is very concerning. So rather than genuine conflict, we have a kind of simulacrum of debate. People are afraid to take on real issues. And of course, there's a lot to that there's an attempt to ameliorate social issues on the level of the symbolic. Of course, social problems are expressed through the symbolic, but can you merely change the symbolic and resolve racism or the treatment of ethnic minorities? What is happening, though, is that this pressure of different interest groups on institutions is making them either censor something that's already in existence or decide not to have particular programming. And now for the hope. To me, having worked in that sphere for a long time and looking back in history, I'd say that censorship will always be with us. It's always been there since, you cannot find a cultural moment that has not had censorship. And it comes in both ways. It comes because of resistance to change. For instance, the allergy to critique demonstrated by totalitarian regimes. On the other hand, it comes from the desire for rapid transition to new social norms. This is the destruction of old gods when a new regime comes in, the destruction of old symbols of political power that we saw in Eastern Europe. So there's an impulse to censor on both sides. And those, we as humans always believe in the absoluteness of our truth, and given the power to control, being weak, we want to censor. And attempts to censor come from the religious right, but they also come from the gay and lesbian community, from feminists, from Black Lives Matter today. So they come from all sides. But I could say also more optimistically that this impulse to censor is also a recognition of the power of art. Censorship controversy, in a way, is a sign that there is robust art production, that there is a lively democratic exchange of ideas. And the more scary thing is a kind of silent and non-contested space where there is no controversy. And this becomes very, very sinister. The absence of controversy does not mean we all get along, but that self-repression has won over. Indeed, the very presence of difference, of alterity, is often marked by attempts to suppress it. But of course, there is a difference between controversy and actual suppression. And in response to this, we need both reactive and proactive strategies, as I mentioned before. And on the reactive side, there are many organizations, international as well as local, that work to counter censorship. And these are, Free Muse, whose report I mentioned, Article 19, Amnesty International, PEN International has been very active, Index on Censorship, ICORN, you probably know all these organizations. There are also specific artist organizations that have also been active on freedom of speech issues. Just lately, the Mellon Foundation sponsored a pilot program called the Artist Protection Fund, which creates residencies for artists at risk in various colleges and educational institutions around the world. So there's a lot is being done, and we need to work more to connect with local knowledge, to connect with local groups, to have more than the sum of parts, to have something that works together. And I've been involved in an organization called ArtsFacts, which is about that, mapping existing resources and working together to respond. Speaking of responding, I have a call for action here connected to the imprisonment of Ashraf Fayyad. And Marianne de Vlieg, who probably a lot of you know, is really asking people to put messages on Ashraf's website, which is ashraffayyad.com, and I can give it to you later. Especially because the 21st of March, next Monday, is World Poets Day. So Ashraf is a poet and a curator and an artist, and support from people around the world would help him personally, but also demonstrate international support for his cause. He's in jail in Saudi Arabia for his work. There's also a Twitter handle that I can give to you. But there's something we can all do individually and organizationally. But I think it's also important to think beyond the reactive, beyond the campaigns that we all do in response to imprisonments, to censorship. We need to do two things. We need to, on the one hand, strengthen existing institutions so that they can actually do more controversial work. And we also need to think of new structures and imaginative alternatives. And I think your incubators are a great idea in that direction. We often think with censorship, we think of the artists, but there's the institution, and the institution is key in providing access to art and disseminating ideas. It's not about just the artist being free to make art. This art has to make it somehow in the public sphere. So the institution is key, whether it's a big institution or a small institution. And one thing we've been doing is create this kind of museum best practices, which are guidelines for institutions for how to handle controversy, what they can do, and how can they negotiate, who they need to negotiate with, very practical details of how you can get controversial programming out without being attacked in an unproductive way. You might be attacked, and you have to take into account that you will be attacked, but how do you survive the attack, and how do you turn controversy into productive dialogue? And then there are all these new platforms that have been appearing. The latest one is Tania Bruguera, the Cuban artist. She just crowdfunding, and she was very successful actually crowdfunding it. She started the Hannah Arendt Institute for Civic Literacy in Havana, which will be residencies from artists, but also a way to educate people about civic literacy. And then, of course, there's SALT in Istanbul, there's Artist Village in Singapore, San Art. All of these new forms support multidisciplinary work, bringing in artists, academics, others. They engage audience as participants. They're not just serving content, they're truly engaging people. They're stressing the civic mission of an art institution. And they're also working to democratize, to challenge hierarchy and hegemony, and to empower agency in this kind of flat, non-hierarchical model. And these projects go beyond reacting. They open room for the unexpected, for the uncontrolled, for the unpredictable, for addressing contradictions and failures. So you don't know what is going to happen, but something interesting might emerge. And here I come back to the definition of freedom that I mentioned in the beginning. Artistic freedom is not solely about the lifting of oppression. To have true freedom beyond the essential work of countering the individual instance of censorship or violation of an artist's right, we need to look into the long term and work proactively. We need the ability to imagine alternatives, new models of cultural participation, new ways of engagement. To have true freedom, we need to develop structures that can form new models and alternative ways of understanding, and also transforming our social realities. And above all, we need to understand that artistic freedom is a process, and it's not a static condition. It's not a place where we can go and rest. We need to always work towards it. Thank you.
Merci, Svetlana.
Outstanding presentation.
Pour cette merveilleuse présentation. Nous sommes un peu en retard, mais nous avons
time for a few questions from the audience.
Le temps de prendre quelques questions.
I was struck by a
Moi, j'ai
few
été
things
marqué par certains
speech.
points.
One sentence
que vous avez
is very interesting for me.
soulevé.
It says
Une
private
phrase,
companies
c'est-à-dire,
can
les
censor
entreprises
whatever
privées
they want.
peuvent
So
censurer
I
ce
find
qu'ils
it very
veulent. L'entreprise privée peut ce qu'elles veulent. Donc ça me paraît très intéressant lorsqu'on pense à Farida Shahid, vous savez, c'est la rapporteuse sur les droits culturels. Elle a achevé sa mission maintenant, mais elle a proposé quelques rapports. Et il y en a un qui me paraît très intéressant, c'est un rapport où elle parle des effets des monopoles de communication sur les droits culturels. Alors je pense qu'il y a un lien ici entre disons, l'ultracapitalisme.
Censorship that is to be put under the lights, because we always think this is coming from some dictatorship somewhere far from us, but in fact it is there. And also what you said about the implication of the social networks on this diminution of freedom space is also very interesting and unexpected. Also, I take the chance to remind about Ahmed Nagi, who is a young Egyptian writer who's been cast in jail 3 weeks ago for 2 years, which is another case, one of many. But this one is very special because he got the approval from the censorship authority of Egypt on his text. Therefore, he thought he had the green light. Then they published his article in the newspaper, and then they took him in jail. You know, it's very nasty and very unpleasant. So this can even happen. So this is the censorship inside the censorship. It's a double censorship, I find it. So maybe you have a few reactions on that, and maybe we can open the floor. There are microphones here, and you can talk either in French or in English, because we have the interprets over there doing their very good job. Thank you, gentlemen. Anything on that?
Talking about the companies, it actually struck me as, you know, having lived in Eastern Europe, and now Eastern Europe has opened up. There is no really, well, there is no official state censorship. But you go there and people are, it's just suddenly shifted. You were thinking before about the state, now you're thinking of who gives you the money and what can you allow yourself. It's not even, sometimes it's not even recognized as censorship. It's saying, well, you know, there was a show in Sofia, it was sponsored by the World Monetary Fund, and they said no nudes. And I said, well, you know, they can't really be saying this. They can't be putting those conditions. And the answer was, well, they're paying for this. Mm-hmm. So it's what worries me when these things are taken for granted. Mm. When, you know, even in the U.S., I have to argue this, because there's people who say, well, why are you talking about censorship? This is a private company. They could decide to fund what they wish. This is not censorship. I'm like, well, what are we thinking here about? We have what we should put as a value is the public sphere, the public interest. What happened to the public interest in all the discourse of money and economics? The public interest becomes something that we do not even discuss as a value.
Yeah. Any questions, reactions, please? These 2 days are supposed to be very participative. Vicky Ann, eventually you can introduce yourself very briefly.
Vicky Ann Cremona, I come from Malta. I think I've just picked up on something you've just said about the public interest, because exactly the whole concept of public interest and public sphere with regard to who defines what the public interest is the first element towards censorship. Because in countries where, for example, nudity is not allowed or in-your-face theatre is not allowed, the big argument is it is against the public interest. And the whole debate is it actually in the public interest? I mean, given the contents of the plays themselves. And I wonder what your opinion would be about this kind of censorship in the sense that, for example, in certain countries, one of the arguments is that the laws to free censorship are much faster than what the people's acceptance of that non-censorship is. That is one of the bigger arguments.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, because censorship, by definition, is the suppression of something in the name of the public good. So when we're talking about public good, we have this competing public goods. I think, my argument would be that this is there is the public interest in the free exchange of ideas, rather than the public interest in not having one's religion offended and so on. But it is a kind of there are two ways to approach freedom of speech, and one is as a right, as a natural human right, and the other is the utilitarian argument, that it is the John Stuart Mill argument, that the truth comes out in open and free debate. So, and that is the public good argument. But it is there is a competition of values there when you're having the argument, right?
Yes, Ulrich. One or two, and then we stop. There will be plenty of time too. So Ulrich and then Vahid.
Thank you very much for your speech. Very interesting. I just want to add.
Would you introduce yourself very briefly?
My name is Ulrich Fuchs. I'm living in Marseille. Was former director of European Capital of Culture, Marseille, Provence. But originally I'm German, living in Marseille. And I'm saying this because I want to come back to a discussion which is actually going on in Germany, which I find quite interesting. Mr. Zuckerberg was recently in Berlin, and he met the Minister of Interior Affairs and the Chancellor and so on, discussing the censorship of very right-wing xenophobia interventions on Facebook and other social media. There is a sensitive debate in Germany about, actually because of the refugee crisis, and more people from the Pegida and right-wing parties are, without of course giving their name, are blaming and attacking mayors or politicians who intervene for, I would say, good reasons, to protect refugees, to welcome refugees from Syria and Germany, to defend the politics of the Chancellor and so on. And I understood everything you said, and I agree with you in general, but seeing this debate in Germany and the risk of right-wing parties, as everywhere in Europe, where you have more or less now semi-fascist governments in Poland, in Hungary, and so on, I would say to intervene against racial or xenophobia, anonymous remarks on Facebook and so on, is something where I would not resist. I would not say I would agree either.
I think we can have a very long discussion about hate speech. And I know, speaking in Europe, probably people are more are less opposed to hate speech legislation than the U.S. is. And as you know, the U.S. has no. The U.S. signed the Covenant of Human Rights, which defines hate speech, making an exception, saying we will not do anything that goes against the First Amendment. So there is hate crime in the U.S. So if you commit a crime against, for instance, somebody who's gay, and the crime is motivated by your homophobia, then you have higher penalties. But if you tell somebody, unless it's direct violence, if you say I hate gays, it's okay. Now, but there is the larger argument: why do we protect hate speech? And it's a large number of arguments. One is who defines it. And I have a friend who I've always on censorship panels with him because he was censored. He's African American, and he said, "No, this one line we should draw is hate speech. The N-word we should not have." Now he's changed his mind because, the Black Lives Matter movement against police brutality. Some people in the police are calling Black Lives Matter hate speech. And so this raises question number one is who is defining hate speech? And you go to like Geert Wilders, who was accused of hate speech, but it was found that his speech, the fitna, the film attacking the Quran and wanting to get Muslims out of the country, that was found to be okay political speech. At the same time, Pussy Riot in Russia, doing their performance, were convicted for hooliganism and inspiring hatred against religion. So question number one is who defines it? If you have somebody in power that you like, okay. If you have somebody that has different views, what will happen? Then one of my favorite quotes is a U.S. Supreme Court justice who said, "Sunlight is the best disinfectant." And let's talk, say, about Holocaust denial and literature on Holocaust denial. That is legal in the US, just about nowhere else. But if you have the arguments of those people, which are very easily countered, you can see what they're saying. You can counter it with more speech. You can argue against it. If you don't see it, it's underground. It becomes, in a way, martyred. And it thrives. And I mean, I have to say, Europe has had hate speech laws for a very long time. Look what's going on. And the US doesn't. And, we have a kind of open debate. You don't have the kind of, sort of very right-wing extremism. And Nazi parties have survived in Europe, even against the law of hate speech. So has it really worked? Or has it worked to remove this kind of extreme movements from the public debate, from the public sphere? And there's another quote saying the answer to bad speech is more speech, not enforced silence. So I think there are many arguments to say that you can that open critique and having these ideas out where they could be shown for how bankrupt they are is better in terms of the ideas being revealed for their kind of intellectual bankruptcy. But also, I think the other point is about like enforcement, that you don't want to have a law and then have somebody in power that is going to enforce that law against Black Lives Matter, for instance.
Yeah. Last question, Vahid.
My name is Vahid. I'm from Iran. I'm on the board of Roberto Cimetta. Part of what I wanted to say has been already discussed. What I'm curious about is who has the authority to define when it is not state censorship. Because I think the romantic ideas of John Stuart Mill, of this utopian liberalism, can only function when we have a homogeneous bourgeois society which is built on slavery. But we don't live in that society. So how can actually different hate speech, pernicious activities in the name of art or debates in social and political spheres can be referred to an authority when it's in terms of public good, for example, and who represents that authority, and how do we arrive at any conclusion? For example, if we have an artist who just makes an art exhibition of digital ways of tracking down refugees to kill them, because that artist doesn't like the idea of the presence of the refugees here, what do we do? And if we momentarily put aside our bias of being the good people as art and cultural organizations, how do we actually make that reference? And when it's really harmful in terms of like terrorists killing journalists, that refers back to the authority of the judiciary, of the state. But when the harmfulness of the activities are not so obvious, what is the point of reference?
Can you give me an example? Because what the example that you're giving about the tracking website, that would go into, that would be a direct threat to the life. And actually there was a website in the US called the Nuremberg Files, and it had nothing to do with Nuremberg. It was a website constructed by pro-life anti-abortion activists, and it had the addresses and the names of doctors who performed abortions. There was a big law case against it, and it was shut down because, I mean, actually people in the free speech world did not quite agree. I thought, of course it should be. I mean, basically you put a target on that person. So it crosses from speech into action. But when you're talking about pure speech and the harm of pure speech, say, you know, what kind of ideas can you disseminate, then it becomes problematic. Then if you're saying, well, this idea could be harmful, there's no end to the material that you can stop. And that was, say, the case, let's go away from politics, pornography. And there have been, you know, feminists made many attempts to say pornography is harmful to women, it causes attitudes of objectification of women, and so on. And there was Catherine McKinnon was a lawyer very active in creating laws against pornography. And one of those laws was seen in court. And what's interesting in the decision was the concept of mental intermediation, saying whatever we receive as advocacy, as ideas, goes through a process of mental intermediation. We're not, we don't automatically respond to somebody doesn't say, oh, no, there's porn, you go and rape a woman. There are all these other elements that go into human motivation. It's the same with xenophobic speech. People can respond in various ways. But if, on the contrary, say, well, what's the harm? Let's just cut that speech. Then where do you stop and where do you draw the line?
I just want to add something up. I'm in total favor of freedom of absolute speech. But what I'm saying, it is the freedom of expression doesn't stop at expression, because we are dealing with imbalance of social power, and I think that is a wider area to discuss than just question of censorship.
I think you're very right. And I think we should also be working against the imbalance in social power. I think what's happening now in the US around that particular issue is there's a lot of work on the level of the symbolic, on the level of language, on the level of stopping language, not enough work on the level of structural issues like work opportunities. You know, look at art spaces, they're not diverse. So we need to have more diversification, and we have to figure out the problem of police brutality, educational opportunities. So those issues of social inequality are not going to be resolved by controlling language. But we need to be doing a lot of work. And free speech is not, it is in an unequal environment, absolutely. And it's a problem.
Thank you so much, Svetlana. So I will give you more hints about what will be the speed dating tonight. Svetlana will be one of the hosts on these tables, but I will give you more after this coffee pause that we all deserve. We are late, so we should take a short coffee pause, maybe maximum 15 minutes would be great. And then we start the first conversation. Thank you.